The medical bay of Vethra Prime hummed with activity as physicians from 6 different species worked to stabilize Yuna's wounds. She lay on a treatment bed designed for beings much larger than humans, surrounded by equipment that beeped and clicked in unfamiliar pattern. Skeleton had not left her side since she collapsed. Moments after Drav's surrender, the adrenaline that had kept her moving through 23 minutes of combat had finally faded, revealing the true extent of her injuries. She had lost nearly 2 liters of blood, and 3 of her ribs were cracked from impacts she had not even registered during the fight. But she was alive. She was alive. And so was Drav, and somewhere across the sector, an entire colony world was waking up to the news that their freedom had been won. The consortium has formally withdrawn all debt claims against Sethan IV, Kelvin reported, reading from a display beside her bed. They are also facing investigation from the Galactic Trade Authority for predatory lending practices. Yuna smiled weakly, her eyes still closed. Good. There are 17 diplomatic delegations requesting meetings with you once you recover. And the human ambassador has submitted a formal apology for attempting to interfere with your champion's rights. He was just doing his job. He was wrong, Kelvin said firmly, and I think he understands that now. The door to the medical bay opened, and a massive figure filled the entrance. Drav Sola stood there, his scales bearing fresh treatment seals over the minor wounds Yuna had inflicted behind him. 2 Karathi guards waited nervously, unsure whether their commander's presence here was permitted. Kelvin's blade arms rose instinctively, but Yuna reached out to touch his carapace. Let him in. Drav approached the bed slowly, his movements lacking the predatory grace he had displayed in the arena. He looked diminished somehow, though his physical form remained as imposing as ever. I have come to understand something, he said, his deep voice filling the room. All my life, I was taught that strength meant domination, that the strong rule and the weak submit, because this is the natural order. He looked down at his clawed hands, weapons that had taken so many lives. But you showed me something different today, human. What did I show you? That sometimes the strongest thing a warrior can do is choose not to kill. Drav met her eyes with an intensity that made the guards shift uncomfortably. I have won 47 combat challenges for the consortium, and I never questioned whether those victories were just, and I never asked whether the causes I championed were worthy. He lowered his head, a gesture of profound respect among the Karathi. You fought for strangers because it was right, and you spared me because killing me would have served no purpose beyond vengeance. What will you do now? Yuna asked. I am returning to my homeworld to speak with the elder councils, and I will tell them what I witnessed here today. Rumble that might have been laughter or grief emerged from his chest. Perhaps they will listen, or perhaps they will call me weak and cast me out. But either way, I cannot pretend that nothing has changed. He straightened and pressed one claw against his chest in a formal salute. May your hunts always find prey. Human, though I suspect your prey is something more abstract than mine ever was. Drav turned and left the medical bay, his guards following in confused silence. Eccleston watched him go with an expression of wonder. I have studied the Karathi for years, and I have never seen one behave that way. People can surprise you, Yuna said. Even people you think you understand. In the days that followed, news of the arena challenge spread across the galactic communication networks. What had begun as a minor legal dispute between a corporation and a forgotten colony became something larger. A story that species told each other in trading posts and diplomatic halls and military academies. The human who had faced the Karathi champion, the human who had won through endurance rather than force, the human who had offered mercy to a defeated enemy. For most species, humans had been an afterthought, a young race that had spread quickly but accomplished nothing remarkable. They had no great military victories, No technological marvels, no cultural achievements that older civilizations considered significant, but suddenly, ambassadors who had ignored human diplomatic overtures began scheduling meetings. Military commanders who had dismissed human tactical doctrine began requesting training exchanges. Scientists who had considered human biology unremarkable began studying the unique endurance adaptations that had allowed one small woman to outlast an apex predator. Ambassador Chun sat in his office reviewing the flood of communications that had arrived since the combat's conclusion. 17 requests for diplomatic talks had become 53 trade negotiations that had stalled for months were suddenly moving forward, and 3 different species had inquired about the possibility of humans serving as neutral arbiters in their own disputes. She resigned her commission, he muttered to himself. Still trying to process what had happened, she threw away her career to fight for people she had never met. His assistant, a young attach named Rivara, looked up from her own display. Sir, there is a transmission from Earth, marked urgent. Chun opened the channel and found himself facing a screen filled with admirals and senators and representatives from every major power block on the human homeworld. Ambassador Chun, the senior admiral began. We need to discuss what happened on Vethra Prime, of course. Specifically, we need to discuss how we can encourage more of it. Chun blinked in surprise. I do not understand. That woman did more for humanity's galactic standing in 23 minutes than our diplomatic corps has accomplished in 30 years. The admiral leaned forward with an intensity that suggested he had not slept since the combat footage reached Earth. We want to know how we can find more people like her. People who understand that sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. In her medical bed, Eunice slept peacefully for the first time in days, her wounds healing under the care of some of the galaxy's finest physicians. Beside her, Kelvin kept vigil, composing messages to the freed people of Sethan 4 and trying to find words that could express what had been given to them. He thought about the death song he had sung in the arena, the melody of farewell that had echoed through the Colosseum. He had been prepared to die that day, ready to give his life for a cause that seemed hopeless instead. He had watched a human teach the galaxy that there were more ways to win than anyone had imagined. When Yuna finally woke, she found him watching her with his compound eyes. How long was I asleep? She asked. 14 hours, which the physicians say is remarkable recovery time for your species. She smiled at that. Humans are stubborn about healing too. I have been thinking about what you said before the fight. Kelvin told her about not letting anyone feel abandoned the way your colony was abandoned. What about it? I believe you have accomplished more than you know. He gestured toward the window, where ships from dozens of worlds could be seen moving through the station's docking complex. Every species out there is talking about what happened in that arena. Not just the fight, but what came after. He clicked his mandibles in the Rathani equivalent of a smile. You did not just win a challenge. Human, you changed how the galaxy thinks about winning. Yuna looked out at the stars beyond the window, at the vast and ancient civilization that humanity was still learning to navigate. She thought about her grandmother and her sister and the colony that had been left to die. She thought about Drav returning to his homeworld with questions that his people had never considered. She thought about all the small moments of choice that had led her to this place, this time, this unexpected victory. I just did what someone should do, she said softly, and maybe that is exactly what the galaxy needed to see. Kelvin replied outside the medical bay window. The stars continued their ancient dance, indifferent to the concerns of the small beings who traveled between them. But among those beings, something had shifted. New possibility had entered the collective imagination. Of 100 species, the possibility that strength could include mercy, that victory could mean more than destruction, that sometimes the most powerful thing in the universe was simply refusing to give up on humanity, for all its youth and fragility had shown them the way. The long night before combat was meant for rest, but Yuna had other plans. She sat in the small chamber assigned to her, surrounded by holographic displays showing every recorded fight commander, Drav, Soleth had ever participated in. Her eyes moved constantly, tracking patterns that others had missed at the third hour. She noticed something. Drav always led with his right claw. A fraction of a second before his left it was barely detectable. A tiny imbalance in his otherwise perfect form, but it was there at the fifth hour. She found another detail. When Drav faced opponents who retreated, he pursued with increasing aggression, but when opponents circled to his left, he had to pivot his entire body rather than simply turning. His left side was slightly slower to respond at the seventh hour. Yuna stopped watching and began to move. She flowed through stretches and breathing exercises that had been passed down through human martial traditions for thousands of years. This was not preparation for strength, because she would never match a Karathi in raw power. This was preparation for endurance. The human body was a remarkable machine, evolved over millions of years on a world of extremes. Humans could not run as fast as many predators, but they could run for longer. They could not strike as hard as most dangerous animals, but they could keep fighting long after those animals had collapsed from exhaustion on ancient Earth. Human hunters had chased prey for days, simply refusing to stop until their target's heart gave out. Yuna intended to bring that same relentless endurance to the arena. A knock at her door interrupted her routine. She opened it to find Kelthon standing outside with a container of prepared food. "The Karathi do not eat before combat," he said, offering the container. "They believe hunger sharpens their instincts." Yuna took the food and began eating immediately, not caring how it might look to alien observers. "Good," she said between bites. "Let him be hungry. Let him burn through his energy reserves even faster." Kelthon entered and watched as she consumed the meal with mechanical efficiency. "The station's betting markets have set odds against you at 200 to 1. "Only 200? Some humans have placed wagers in your favor," which adjusted the numbers slightly. Yuna smiled at that, a genuine expression of warmth that seemed strange given the circumstances. "My people have always been stubborn about supporting long odds. Your ambassador attempted to reach you earlier," Kelthon added. "He demanded that station security grant him access." "What did you tell them?" "That you had resigned your commission and were no longer under his authority." Yuna nodded, having expected as much. Ambassador Chun was a good man, but he thought in terms of diplomatic consequences and political fallout. He could not understand why someone would throw away their career and possibly their life for people they had never met. Perhaps that was why. Humanity needed soldiers as well as diplomats. The hours passed, and Yuna alternated between rest and movement, keeping her body warm and loose while conserving her energy. She did not sleep deeply, but she slept enough, trusting in techniques she had learned during survival training to maximize recovery in minimal time. In another part of the station, Drav Soleth prowled his own preparation chamber with growing irritation. The human's decision to cut the preparation time had unsettled him in ways he did not want to admit. She should be terrified. She should be desperately trying to delay the inevitable. Instead, she had chosen to rush toward her death with apparent eagerness. It made no sense. He had reviewed what little information existed about human combat capabilities, and none of it suggested any threat. They were slow, weak, and fragile compared to any species that had earned respect in the galactic community. Their only notable achievement was spreading across a surprisingly Large number of worlds in a relatively short time, and yet something about this human bothered him perhaps. It was the way she had walked onto the arena. Floor with steady steps, perhaps it was the calm in her voice when she had spoken the words of challenge perhaps. It was the look in her eyes when she had met his gaze across the fighting space. A look that held no fear at all. Drav shook off the feeling and returned to his exercises. Did not matter what the human felt or planned in 12 hours. She would be dead, and this strange interruption would be forgotten, back in her chamber. Yuna completed her final preparations. She had chosen her weapons carefully. The simple staff for defense and distance control. The short blade for decisive moments. She would wear no armor because armor would slow her down. And speed was her only advantage. Looking at herself in the reflective surface of the wall, she saw a small human woman with dark hair tied back and eyes that had seen too much death already. She was 34 years old and had spent half her life training for moments exactly like this. Not specifically arena combat against alien champions, but moments where everything depended on being smarter, tougher, and more determined than seemed possible. Her hand moved to the photograph she had brought with her. A small image showing 2 young girls and an elderly woman standing outside a prefab shelter. The shelter had been on her colony world, and the elderly woman had been her grandmother, and the smaller of the 2 girls had died 3 years after this photo was taken because the famine had weakened her immune system beyond recovery. Yuna had survived. She had clawed her way off that dying colony and into Earth's military academy. She had trained and studied and fought until she became one of humanity's foremost experts in xenocombat tactics, and she had sworn that she would never stand by while others suffered the abandonment she had known. I will not let them down, she whispered to the photograph. Will not let any of them down. When the summons came to report to the arena, Yuna was ready. She walked through the corridors of Vethra Prime with the staff in her hand and the blade at her hip, past crowds of aliens who had gathered to witness what they assumed would be a brief and bloody execution. Some looked at her with pity, some looked at her with confusion. A few, scattered here and there, looked at her with something that might have been hope at the entrance to the arena. Kelthon waited for her. Whatever happens today, he said, you have already given my people something they did not have before. What is that? A reason to believe that the galaxy might be better than we feared. Yuna reached out and touched his damaged carapace gently. Watch carefully, she said, and whatever you see, do not look away. She stepped through the doors and into the light of the arena, and the roar of the crowd washed over her like a wave somewhere across the fighting floor. Drav Solith was waiting. The battle for Sethenfor was about to begin. The first seconds of combat unfolded exactly as Yuna had predicted. Drav exploded forward with terrifying speed, his massive body crossing the arena floor in a blur of scales and claws. Most opponents would have tried to block or counter, and most opponents would have died in that instant. Yuna did neither. She moved sideways, using the staff to redirect his momentum rather than absorb it, guiding him past her like water flowing around a stone. His claws tore through empty air where she had been standing a heartbeat before. The crowd fell silent in shock. No one had ever survived Drav's opening strike. The karate champion recovered and spun to face her, his predator eyes narrowing as he reassessed the situation. This human was faster than she should be, more aware of his attack than any prey species had a right to be. He lunged again, and again Yuna slipped aside, using footwork that seemed almost casual. Despite its precision, she was not trying to hurt him. She was simply refusing to be where his claws wanted to land. 3 minutes passed. Then 5. The whispers in the observation galleries grew louder as species who had bet on a quick resolution began to understand that something unprecedented was happening. Drav's attacks grew more aggressive, more committed. burning through energy reserves that his body could not replace quickly. Every missed strike cost him something. And Yuna made sure he missed constantly. She circled to his left whenever possible, exploiting the slight weakness she had identified in his pivot response. She varied her distance unpredictably, forcing him to constantly adjust his attack angles. She moved like smoke, impossible to grasp, always just beyond reach at the 10-minute mark. Drav paused to catch his breath, something he had never done in recorded combat. His scales glistened with exertion, and his chest heaved as his massive lungs worked to pull in enough air. Yuna watched him from across the arena, her staff held loosely at her side. She was sweating and bleeding from a shallow cut on her arm, where one of his claws had grazed her. But her breathing remained controlled. "Are you tired already?" she called out, her voice carrying across the fighting floor. "Perhaps your consortium should have sent someone stronger." The taunt struck exactly as she intended. Karethi pride could not tolerate such insults, especially not from a species they considered beneath contempt. Drav roared and charged with renewed fury, his attacks becoming faster but also sloppier as emotion began to override. Training Yuna paid for her provocation with a deep gash across her ribs, his claws tearing through her shirt, and the flesh beneath pain exploded through her side. But she had trained for this, had conditioned herself to keep moving through damage that would paralyze most fighters. She used the moment of contact to strike upward with her staff, catching Drav across the eyes. The blow did not penetrate his armored scales, but the impact disrupted his vision long enough for her to create distance again. Now he was angry and partially blinded and tired. Now the real fight could begin. 15 minutes into the combat, Kelvin watched from the edge of the arena with something like disbelief. The human was still standing, not just standing, but fighting, adapting, surviving in ways that should have been impossible. Every time Drav seemed about to land a killing blow, she found some way to slip aside or deflect the force. Every time he tried to corner her, she created angles of escape that he had not anticipated. She was bleeding from multiple wounds now, leaving trails of red across the arena floor. But she showed no sign of stopping. In the Karathi observation gallery, the consortium representatives had stopped speaking entirely. They stared down at the arena floor with expressions of mounting horror as their undefeatable champion began to falter. 20 minutes. Drav was staggering now, his legendary endurance finally reaching its limits, the explosive metabolism that made Karathi such terrifying warriors in short engagements had become a liability. He had burned through reserves that should have lasted for hours, spent by a fight that refused to end. Yuna circled him slowly, watching for the moment when his legs would finally give out. Her own body screamed with exhaustion and pain, and she had lost enough blood that the edges of her vision were starting to blur. But she could feel something shifting in the arena, something that went beyond the physical contest. The crowd had grown quiet, not with boredom, but with awe. Species that had come to watch a brief execution were witnessing something they had never seen before. Karathi brought low by something other than superior force. Drav swung at her again, a desperate attack that lacked the precision of his earlier strikes. Yuna stepped inside his reach, accepting a glancing blow to her shoulder in exchange for the chance to drive her staff into his knee joint. The impact sent him stumbling, and for the first time in the match, he felt one massive knee hit the arena floor, and the sound echoed through the Colosseum like a thunderclap. Yuna stood over him, breathing hard, her staff raised for what could be a finishing strike to his throat. The arena held its breath. The arbiter watched with ancient eyes that had seen countless warriors choose the killing blow. The Karathi consortium prepared to witness the death of their greatest champion. And Yuna lowered her weapon. "Yield," she said, her voice rough with exhaustion. "You have fought with honor. Now yield and live." Drav stared up at her with an expression that his species had never worn before in public. Confusio Karathi did not yield. They fought until victory or death, because surrender was worse than dying, but he could not continue. His body had nothing left to give, and they both knew it. Why? He managed to ask, "Why would you spare an enemy?" Yuna knelt so that her eyes were level with his, ignoring the pain that shot through her wounded side. "Because killing you does not free those people," she said. "Only the tribunal's ruling can do that. And I've already won the right to that ruling through combat." She reached out her hand. The same gesture she had offered to Kelthon the day before. "I did not come here to kill," she continued. "I came here to prove that there is another way. A way where victory does not require destruction." Drav looked at her hand as if it were the strangest thing he had ever seen around the arena. Thousands of observers waited to see what the Karathi champion would choose in this moment. Something more than a simple combat was being decided. This was a question being posed to the entire galaxy. Could victory exist without annihilation? Could strength include mercy? Could enemies become something else? Slowly, painfully, Drav reached up and grasped their hand. "I yield," he said. And the words seemed to cost him as much as the fight itself. The arena erupted. Every species present began reacting according to their nature. Some with confusion, some with anger, some with wonder. But above it all, cutting through the chaos, came the voice of High Arbiter Thiessen. "The combat is concluded," she declared. "Victory belongs to the human champion. And the challenge is resolved in favor of the Rathani colony of Sethan IV. Kelthon fell to his knees as the words reached him. His blade arms pressed against his chest in the Rathani gesture of overwhelming emotion. His people were free against all probability, against everything the galaxy had believed about power and strength and inevitable outcomes. His people were free, and it had been a human who made it possible. The preparation chamber beneath the arena was cold and gray, its walls lined with weapon racks holding implements of death from 100 different worlds. Yuna stood before them, her arms crossed as she studied the options with the careful eye of someone who had trained for this moment her entire adult life. Behind her, Kelthon paced on his 4 legs, his damaged carapace clicking with each agitated step. "You cannot do this," he said for the 7th time since they had left the arena floor. "The challenge has already been accepted." Yuna replied without turning around. "Then withdraw it." "No," Kelthon made a sound of pure frustration, something between a hiss and a screech that his translator could not render into human speech. He circled around to face her directly, lowering his angular head until his compound eyes were level with hers. "Do you understand what you are facing? Drav Solith has killed 47 opponents in ritual combat alone, and hundreds more in military campaigns across 3 sectors. I read his file. His scales can deflect plasma fire at close range. I know. His venom can dissolve bone within minutes. I am aware," Kelthon reared back, his blade arms spreading in a gesture of utter bewilderment. "Then why? Why would you throw your life away for strangers you have never met?" Yuna finally turned to look at him, and something in her expression made the Rathani warrior go still. It was not fear that he saw in those alien eyes. It was something else entirely. Something that looked almost like recognition. "When I was 9 years old," she said quietly, "my colony world requested emergency assistance from Earth's government during a famine crisis." She reached up to touch a small scar beneath her left eye, a thin line of white against her brown skin. "They refused because we were not economically significant enough to justify intervention. And 17,000 people died before private relief ships arrived." Kelthon said nothing. "I watched my grandmother starve so that my sister and I could eat." Yuna continued. "She told us it was her choice, that she was old and we were young, that this was what family did for each other." She turned back to the weapon racks, her hands moving across the handles of various blades. "I swore that day that I would never let anyone feel as abandoned as my people felt. And I've spent my entire life preparing to keep that promise. But you cannot possibly defeat a Karathi in single combat. Kelthon protested. Their species evolved as apex predators, while humans are barely above prey animals on most galactic scales. Small smile crossed Yuna's face. Tell me more about Karathi combat doctrine. Question caught Kelthon off guard. What? Their fighting style, their tactics, their psychology in battle. Yuna said, you have clearly studied them extensively to prepare your own challenge. So share what you know. Kelthon hesitated, then began to speak. They favor overwhelming force applied in short bursts, using their superior speed and strength to end confrontations quickly. Why quickly? Because their metabolism burns energy at an extreme rate during combat. Kelthon explained. They evolved as ambush predators, designed for explosive attacks rather than prolonged engagement. Yuna nodded slowly, her eyes distant as she processed this information. And what happens if the fight drags on? It never does, as no one has ever survived long enough to test their endurance. Until now, Kelthon stared at her. And slowly he began to understand what he was seeing. This human was not brave in the way he had first assumed. Not some idealistic fool rushing toward a noble death. She was calculating. She had a plan. The Karathi consider prolonged combat shameful, he said slowly, thinking through the implications. A warrior who cannot finish his opponent quickly is seen as weak by their culture. So if I can survive the initial assault and keep the fight going, I attack both his body and his pride. Yuna selected a simple wooden staff from the rack, testing its weight and balance with practiced movements. What else? For the next hour, Kelthon shared everything he knew about Karathi physiology and psychology, while Yuna listened with absolute focus. She asked questions that revealed a deep understanding of combat dynamics, probing for weaknesses that Kelthon had never thought to exploit when he described their sensory capabilities. She asked about their blind spots when he explained their scale armor. She asked about the joints and gaps when he detailed their venomous claws. She asked how quickly the venom could be delivered and whether there was a delay between strikes. Finally, Kelthon fell silent. Having exhausted his knowledge, you are not what I expected from a human, he admitted. Yuna set down the staff and picked up a short blade, examining its edge with a critical eye. Most species look at humans and see weakness because we lack natural weapons and armor. She slid the blade into a simple sheath at her waist. What they do not see is that we evolved on a world that was trying to kill us. And we survived anyway. The door to the chamber opened, and a Velothi attendant entered with formal robes for the preparation ritual. Champion, you have been granted the standard 24-hour preparation period before combat resumes. I only need 12. Yuna said. The attendant blinked in confusion. And even Kelthon made a sound of surprise. I want him thinking about me, Yuna explained. I want him wondering why I cut the time short. What I might know that he does not. What I might be planning. She turned to Kelthon and extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting. Thank you for the information. And I promise you that I will not waste this chance. Kelthon looked at the offered hand, then slowly reached out with one blade arm to touch her palm in acceptance. Among my people, when someone offers their life for another, we perform a bonding ritual, he said. It makes us clan family, bound together regardless of what happens next. I would be honored. As the ancient words were spoken and the connection was formed, Kelthon felt something he had not expected when he walked into the arena that morning. Hope above them. News of the human champion spread across Vethra Prime and beyond, transmitted through communication relays to 100 worlds, in ships and stations and colonies throughout the sector. Humans stopped what they were doing to watch one of their own had stepped forward. One of their own was about to face the impossible, and though none of them could explain why, they all felt certain that this was about to become something historic. The arena stretched outward like a metal cathedral, its curved walls rising toward a domed ceiling where thousands of viewing platforms hung suspended in the air. Keltham Varus stood alone at the center of the fighting floor, his four legs trembling beneath him as blue blood dripped from the cracks in his carapace. He was Rithani, an insectoid species whose natural armor had evolved over millions of years to withstand the harsh conditions of their volcanic homeworld. But that armor meant nothing here. The Tribunal Coliseum on Vethra Prime had seen countless disputes settled through ritual combat, and today it would witness Another lifted his blade arms toward the light filtering through the dome above, watching the gleam dance across their serrated edges. These weapons had served him well in the preliminary rounds, but they would not save him from what came next. High Arbiter Thiessen observed from her elevated platform, her ancient Velothi features betraying no emotion as she reviewed the terms of the challenge. The Velothi had administered these proceedings for 3,000 years, and Thiessen herself had presided over more than 100,000 combat resolutions. She had seen warriors of every species meet there, and on this floor today would be no different. The challenger Kelthan Voruses of the Rithani colony world Sethenfor has brought grievance against the Karathi Trade Consortium, Thiessen announced, her voice carried by amplifiers throughout the arena. He claims the consortium has enslaved his people through predatory debt practices and demands their liberation. Kelthan clicked his mandibles in acknowledgement, the sound echoing in the vast space. It was true. The Karathi had come to his world offering development loans and infrastructure investment within 3 generations. They owned everything his people worked in mines extracting ore that was shipped off-world, receiving just enough payment to service the interest on debts they could never repay. When Kelthan had tried to challenge this through legal channels, he discovered the Karathi had purchased the judges too, so he had come here, to the one place where wealth could not buy victory. The Rithani government has formally disavowed this challenge. Thiessen continued, the challenger stands without national backing or appointed champion. Of course they had disavowed him. The Rithani homeworld could not afford war with the Karathi, and officially supporting his challenge would be seen as an act of aggression. They had sacrificed one colony to preserve the peace. Kelthan understood their reasoning even as he hated them for it. In the observation galleries above, representatives from dozens of species watched with varying degrees of interest. The Morvathi delegation wagered amongst themselves, their tentacles passing currency back and forth as they calculated odds. The Dreneth ambassadors observed with their compound eyes, recording everything for later analysis, and in a small section reserved for a species most considered unremarkable, a single human woman sat forward in her seat. Sergeant Unipark had been stationed on Vethra Prime for 11 months as part of humanity's effort to establish diplomatic presence in the galactic core. Her duties were simple: observe, report, and avoid causing incidents. She was supposed to be invisible, but as she watched the wounded Rithani standing alone against impossible odds, she found herself gripping the railing until her knuckles turned white. The doors at the far end of the arena groaned open, and the crowd fell silent. Commander Drav Soleth entered with the unhurried confidence of an apex predator who had never known defeat. He stood 3 meters tall, his scaled hide gleaming under the arena lights like polished obsidian. The Karathi were ambush hunters on their homeworld, capable of explosive bursts of speed that let them take down prey twice their size. Evolution had blessed them with redundant organs, venomous claws, and a skeletal structure that could withstand impacts that would shatter most. Species Drav had killed 47 opponents. In this arena he had never taken more than 3 minutes to do. Kelthan watched his death approach and felt a strange calm settle over him. He had known this moment was coming from the instant he filed his challenge. The Karathi would never send a weak champion, and no one would stand for a disavowed colony, but at least his death would be recorded. At least the galaxy would see what the Karathi had done and how far they would go to protect their profits. He began the death song of his people, a clicking melody that rose from deep within his thorax. The sound was beautiful and terrible, a farewell to life performed by warriors who knew they would not survive. Across the arena, several Rithani observers joined their voices to his, honoring his courage, even as they mourned his inevitable fall. Yuna felt tears forming in her eyes as the alien music washed over her. She did not understand the words, but she understood the meaning. She had heard similar songs on human worlds, in hospitals and battlefields and refugee camps, the melody of those who had accepted their end. Does any present wish to stand as champion for the challenger? Thesan asked, her voice cutting through the death song. It was a formality, a ritual question that had gone answered 1,000 times before. Kelthan did not even pause his singing. Why would anyone risk death for a stranger from a disavowed colony? Silence stretched through the arena as Drav took his position, his claws extending to their full length. The Karathi champion rolled his massive shoulders, loosening muscles that could tear through starship hull plating in 30 seconds. The arbiter would declare the challenge begun in 3 minutes or less. Kelthan would be dead. Yuna stood up. The movement was so unexpected that the delegates around her did not immediately react. She was already climbing over the railing before the human ambassador could grab her arm. Sergeant Park, what are you doing? Ambassador Chen hissed. Something stupid, Yuna replied. She dropped to the next level of platforms, then the next, working her way down toward the arena floor with a speed that drew attention from every corner of the Colosseum. The death song faltered as Kelthan noticed the commotion. Drav paused, his predator eyes tracking the small figure descending through the galleries. I stand as champion, Yuna called out, her voice raw but clear. Thesan leaned forward, her ancient eyes narrowing as she studied the human. You invoke the right of substitution? I do. On what grounds do you claim connection to this challenge? Yuna reached the arena floor and walked toward the center with steady steps that betrayed none of the terror hammering in her chest. 3 months ago, the human government signed mutual defense provisions with the colony of Sethan IV, she said, under Section 7 of the Tribunal Charter. Any sapient with legal connection to a challenged party may offer themselves as champion. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The Karathi delegation erupted in protest, their barking language harsh against the arena acoustics. But Thesan raised one withered hand and silence fell. The claim is valid, the arbiter declared. The human may stand. Kelthan stared at the small creature who had just volunteered to die in his place. Humans were soft, fragile, utterly unremarkable among the species of the galaxy. They had no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities that anyone had documented. This woman had just signed her own death warrant for people she had never met. Why? He asked, his translator rendering the click speech into words she could understand. Yuna looked up at him. This wounded warrior who had given everything for his people and expected nothing in return. Because someone should, she said. The arena erupted in chaos as news spread. Through the station, a human had entered the arena. A human would face the Karathi champion. Every species watching knew they were about to witness something unprecedented. They just did not know yet what kind of unprecedented it would be.